My approach to storytelling is informed by the fact that I've been a novelist for 10 years. It isn't so much that there's no difference between writing for games and writing for static prose. Every medium is different and has its own rules, but I've adapted my game writing from my book writing. Story for me, whatever the medium, is a vehicle for character development. That's the core. Once you know your protagonist, what they want, and what their flaws are, the rest of it, plot, setting, other characters, can be developed in a way that supports this central journey. This isn't the only way to tell a story, of course, but I find it works well for the sort of adventure fiction that fits a game. So in writing Zeitgeist 1980, I started with our protagonist, who is defined almost entirely by the choices the player makes for them. In fiction, we talk about positive and negative character arcs, that is, does the protagonist overcome their misconceptions about the world, or do they double down on it? I use this central choice to structure the game's story. In our case, player choice leaves our character with one of several 80s movie teen archetypes. Jock, preppy, popular kid, punk, goth, nerd, skater, or outsider. The first four we're going to collectively call jerks, and the second four are collectively losers. This distinction matters in exactly one way. Are we lacking in compassion, or are we lacking in courage? Now, I'm not saying that if you fall into one of these archetypes, you are a jerk and you are lacking in compassion, or that you are a loser without courage. I'm just saying that in the world of 80s movies protagonist, this is the sort of character journey we tend to see. And that's the hook that the game hangs itself on. If our players' choices in the game are compassionate, for jerks, or courageous, for losers, then the ending can be considered a positive arc. And if not, then it's a negative arc. Note that I'm not using the terms winning and losing here. You can't really win or lose in the game. These are just positive and negative arcs are just different sorts of choices that bring us to a different conclusion. Admittedly, some of these conclusions may be happier or sadder than others, but in the end, even a sad story is still a story. In Twine, I implemented this as a simple meter that rose or fell depending on the choices made in the game. When we got to the game's climax, we checked to see how well the player had been wrestling with their fatal flaw to see how it all shakes out in the end. In the story, and spoilers here if you want to play the game, maybe skip ahead a bit, you've been shipped off to spend winter break with your irresponsible cousin Colt, who involves you with a last-minute delivery job for the mob. Things go horribly awry, as they tend to do, and at the end of the game you either save him from the mob, or you don't. How you try to save the day is based on the choices you make as a player. Whether you succeed or fail depends on the net compassion or courage of the choices that you've made throughout the whole course of the game. In both cases, though, the player survives to deal with the consequences of success or failure, which for me is far more interesting than simply killing them for making the wrong choice. Okay, that's the end of the spoiler section. A secondary set of meters tracks your relationship with the other characters, which has a sort of gatekeeper effect. Characters will only join you or help you if you've treated them well, and if they like you enough, they may try to stop you from making choices that they consider to be too dangerous or not worth it. That's on the high level. Scene by scene, there are different paths you can take to encounter different scenarios, but ultimately and inevitably, it all comes down to that single climax, that moment where you succeed or fail. Is it fate? Is it karma? Is it the reality of a single-person project trying to maintain scope on explosive combinations of character choices, spiraling out into infinity? Perhaps we'll never know. Now, on to implementation. Twine is a simple markup language that allows for some clever tricks using JavaScript. It runs in a browser, so CSS is used to determine what your game looks and feels like. While I was writing my game in a text editor using Twigo, Twine is intended for use by non-programmers to get the maximum functionality for their games. Inkle, on the other hand, is also a markup language, but the intended application is much different. While the IDE Inkle now gives you the ability to output directly to an HTML file, the core assumption is still that the developer creates the rest of the game in something like Unity or Godot. As such, many of the JavaScript functions I'd written in Twine ended up being offloaded to Godot instead, allowing me to compartmentalize the story into, well, the story. What really made this process fast, though, was the fact that I'd already written all of the prose for the game back in November. For the most part, all I had to do was copy and paste from Twine into Inkle, and then adjust the tags to be more ink-speak. While I'm more familiar with HTML and CSS, I do find that ink makes the writing process faster, and allows me to concentrate on the story and implementation, which allows me to slip into that sort of creative flow state a lot more easily. The last thing I had to consider here was the scope of the project. Now, the main reason I switched from Twine to Godot was that I wanted to add new chapters to the game without breaking players' save files. I see Zeitgeist developing a sort of a serial interactive fiction, so ideally, players will play the new chapter and then wait for the next. So as I'm writing, I try to keep this structure in mind. At the top level, we're telling the story of a kid who comes of age in the weird cinematic version of the 1980s. On the level below that, each individual chapter is an adventure inspired and drawn from 1980s movies. The one I've written, Rascal and the Boxer, was inspired by 1980 action comedy films Smokey and the Bandit 2 and Any Which Way You Can. The next one I write is plotted to include elements from Caddyshack and Alligator. All of those movies were released in 1980, and at this point I'm picturing using a few movies from each year as source material. Ultimately, I'd like the games to span the entire decade, though to be honest, I won't know if there's enough interest to justify spending the time and effort until after the first release, and even then I won't really know for sure. So each chapter has to be written to stand on its own, and has to be final enough to call it a day afterwards if nobody wants to see more, or if I don't feel like developing more. One big change I made between the Twine and Ink release of the first chapter is in scope. The original Twine story was more expansive with, 3 or 4 alternate scenes based on player choice. Ultimately, though, I decided that 99% of players wouldn't play through the game more than once, or often enough to even know that these alternate choices exist. So offering true choice offers no tangible benefit over offering the illusion of choice, and every extra scene does nothing for me but explode the complexity of the project. Again, in solo game development, you really need to optimize the use of your time. And ultimately, choices are only matter if the outcomes are interesting. If they're not interesting, then you're offering the player a boring path, and why would you make a boring game? This devlog was a bit more about story philosophy, but thank you for watching through it. I've got links to the original Twine implementation of Zeitgeist 1980 in the About section below the video if you want to give it a try. At this point, I've got a bare-bones version of the Godot port to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to help them test it out, consider supporting me at the $5 level. Supporters at lower tiers will get to play this version 1 month later. My next task is to work on sound and art assets. Music is going to be relatively simple because I'm just going to be using royalty-free music. So all I have to do is pick something that sounds like it might be an 80s song. I can't compose this myself, and I don't have the money to commission anything, but fortunately I've got a large audio library to sift through. And then it'll be on to art. I will be making low-res pixel art myself to suit the game. If you're a fan, I'll be making some videos of that process, some speed drawing stuff. So think about subscribing to the channel if you don't want to miss those.